Good day, students. Today we're talking about a big job, probably the biggest job in the country, maybe the world. That job, of course, is being the President of the United States. And after watching this video, you should be able to describe the many roles that the President performs for the country. Look, we obviously know that the President has significant responsibilities. And as a country, we look to the President more than any other person or any branch of government to ensure that the country is moving in the right direction. Likewise, the rest of the world looks to the president as the leader of the most powerful nation on the planet to see how the United States will respond to global events and hopefully lead on global and humanitarian issues. So let's look at the roles of the president. First, the president is chief of state. That means that the president is the ceremonial head of government. And if you think about it, it makes sense because there is not a better known current political figure than the president. And when the country needs a representative at a ceremony in the United States or abroad, there's no more obvious symbol of the United States government than the president. The second role the president serves is as chief executive. Now, the Constitution gives the president the executive authority in areas of both foreign and domestic affairs. Now, I know that this is a blast from the past, but it is relevant to our current discussion on the president's executive powers. So you should remember that governments have three powers: the legislative power, which means that the government has the power to make laws, the judicial power, which means the government has the power to interpret laws, and of course, for our conversation, the executive power, the power to enforce laws. Now, the country, to put this in the mildest of terms, is a bit big. There are well over 300 million people that live here. And if you were to drive from New York to LA, you would drive around 2,730 miles. If you were to drive from Seattle to Miami, you would drive around 3,300 miles. Why does this matter? Well, because the president would need to be more powerful than Superman to single-handedly enforce the laws throughout this massive country. That means in order for the president to enforce the laws, the president is going to need some help. So the government has people that works for agencies throughout the nation that carries out the laws. Those people that enforce the laws look for direction and guidance from the president. In other words, you can think of the president as the boss of the people in the government that enforce the laws passed in DC. That means that the president is also the chief administrator because the president is the leader of one of the world's most massive bureaucracies. The federal government has millions of civilian workers, and the president is the one that ultimately oversees all of those employees. Now, other people that work for the president might make mistakes along the way, but it is the president who ultimately has the responsibility. Perhaps the president who expressed this idea most effectively was none other than Missouri's own Harry Truman, who had a sign on his desk in the Oval Office that read, "The buck stops here." Now, the president is so important that he doesn't just have executive powers. The president also has legislative powers, so much so that the president is even called the chief legislator. That's because the president and his staff can and do write laws. He just needs a legislator to submit them. But the president can also use his power to urge and perhaps even persuade Congress to pass legislation. A good example of the president acting as chief legislator is when President Lyndon Johnson, faced with decades of systemic racism and voter suppression in the South, used his authority to try to convince Congress to pass a voting rights bill to make sure that all eligible citizens could exercise their right to vote. In front of a joint session of Congress, the chief legislator said, "On this issue, there must be no delay or no hesitation or no compromise with our purpose. We must not refuse to protect the right of every American to vote in every election that he may desire to participate in. We have already waited 100 years and more, and the time for waiting is gone. So I ask you to join me in working long hours and nights and weekends if necessary to pass this bill." By the way, the Voting Rights Bill passed in 1965 with large majorities in both the House and the Senate. Yet another one of the roles the president has is as chief of party. The president is the de facto leader of his political party. And this makes sense since the president sets both the tone and, in many ways, the agenda of his party. And since members of Congress who belong to the same political party as the president often sink and swim with the president's success and failure, it probably makes sense that the members of the president's party, in most instances at least, publicly support the president and his decisions. Moving on, some people have said the president is also the country's chief economist. While the Congress passes a budget, the president also submits his ideal budget to the legislature. The president will also encourage the Congress to raise or lower taxes and even picks top members of the Federal Reserve. And those members of the Fed have a great deal of power in determining interest rates and how much money is flowing through the American economy. Even more important than influencing the economy, the president also commands the armed forces as commander in chief. This means that the president is the leader of every branch in the United States military. This is one of the president's most important jobs because it is the best way that the president can defend our country, and the decision that the president makes as commander in chief will have life and death implications both for citizens of the United States and people around the world. The president is the country's chief diplomat, too. The diplomat's job is to advance the interests of their own country, while at the same time cultivating a positive relationship with another country's government. The president is our chief diplomat because the president sets the country's foreign policy agenda and is the main spokesperson for the government. We see the president acting in this capacity when the president visits other countries, when the president meets with another country's leader, or even has another head of state over to the White House for dinner. In some ways, I see the chief diplomat as being closely related to the idea that the president is chief citizen. Since the president is chief citizen, he represents every American on the world stage. And even though the president is a member of a political party and may not even be elected by a majority of the American citizens, the president's job is to advance the interests of all Americans, not just those that voted for him. As chief citizen, the president is supposed to lead us in troubling times. The president's job is to be a source of strength when there's a tragedy, represent the unity of the country when there's a disaster, or even be a symbol of strength and confidence when the country is facing a dark hour. So there you have it. Being president is a complicated job. And now that you've seen this video, you should have a better understanding of all the roles that the president is supposed to fill. And you should be able to talk about some of them. Here's a joke. What can you serve but not eat? A tennis ball, and a volleyball, and a subpoena. There's a lot of things that you can serve and not eat. Thanks for watching.